On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we continue our deep dive into the 1893 encyclical Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII. Well, hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. Thanks for tuning in again this week. We apologize that we didn't have a fresh episode for you last week, but we're excited to be back and recording. I'm with, once again, our Chief Operations Officer, Lee Sondano. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Joe. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And we were together last week at the Chesterton Schools Network Summit down in New Orleans. And we won't give a report on that here, but maybe stay tuned. We might maybe publish some extra stuff on the channel. So be sure to subscribe. Be sure to like this podcast, share it. Make sure that you're getting all the updates that you want from the Chesterton Society. We have a lot of news to share. But as promised, with our return this week, we are going to now pick up where we left off a couple weeks ago with our discussion, our kind of paragraph by paragraph analysis of this great landmark encyclical, the so-called Magna Carta of Catholic social doctrine, Rerum Novarum. And so with that, Lee, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Sure, absolutely. It was really fun to spend some time with you last week in New Orleans. You and I, of course, had an opportunity to have an open discussion about AI, and I know that we talked about that a couple of episodes ago, and just how that relates to Pope Leo XIV and Rerum Novarum. And I know we'll get to that soon in the future, but it seems like every opportunity we have, Joe, we're talking about it. People are talking about it. So I think this is really timely. And again, if you haven't listened to the first couple of episodes, please do that. Come back to this one as we dive into chapter 32 or paragraph 32 of Rerum Novarum, this is the point where we're now turning to the responsibilities of the utilization of some of these things that Pope Leo XIII has been talking about. So up to this point, he's been talking through a summary of what it means to, the duties and the rights of a lot of individuals, and now he's specifically getting into the duties of and roles of some different areas of class, basically. And right in paragraph 32, I believe it's talking about the state's role, and then we kind of dive right into it, right? So what does it mean when he's kind of going into these roles? How specific does he get? Let's give a high level maybe of what we're going to be talking about today, and then we can dive right in. But what's the lay of the land? If we're to just go up a little bit in elevation here, what is Pope Leo XIII trying to get at in these next couple of paragraphs?
Yeah, well, I think it's to articulate a vision of polity, a vision of social organization that is really not anything new. It's very ancient. It's Aristotelian in many ways, and then certainly picked up by the great tradition of the church, including by people like St. Thomas Aquinas, especially in De Regno, which is a document on the role of kings that St. Thomas had written. And so this is, as I say, nothing new, but this encyclical is dealing with new things, Rerum Novarum, or revolutions that have taken place in the organization of states and in the organization of polities. And so I think what Leo's preoccupation is, you have to remember always the context of this encyclical and kind of what are the varying currents in society that he's responding to. And on the one hand, you have the emergence of a kind of new totalitarian vision of the state with socialism, whereby the state would be taking over everything, denying the right of private property, and really micromanaging society down to a level that is injurious to man's dignity and to the liberties that individuals have. On the other hand, you have a new experimental kind of philosophy of economics. If you want to use the term laissez-faire, you can. This is sort of the growth of early capitalism as it's coming from thinkers like Adam Smith, and I would point out in particular John Stuart Mill, that had this different idea on the role of the state. And these are bromides that continue to pop up and crop up to this day. If you watch the news and certain economic thinkers are on the news, they'll say things like, all regulation is, even when employed, it's a necessary evil. and things like that. The church has a very different vision of what authority is, what a state's role is. And so this is where I think this is the context, the dialect, or dialectic, if you will, into which Leo is going to enter. And, some people will say this is charting a third way or a middle path. It's really just articulating perennial principles, which really represent a higher vision of the human person and a higher vision of man than materialism, which is at root of both socialism and industrial capitalism propounds. So that's kind of the context, and this is where Leo is going to chart out the course for this is what a state would look like. And so it's not coincidental that in getting into this, he has a little segue, mini paragraph where he says, it's sufficient to inquire what part the state should play in the work of remedy and relief of this situation that he's been laying out. If you remember the beginning of the encyclical, he says the elements of the conflict now raging. He has kind of gone through those elements and analyzed them up to this point of the encyclical, and now he's going to turn to what role each of the players will have in remedy, and he begins with the state. And he immediately mentions his former encyclical on the Christian constitution of the state to key readers into the fact that he's drawing from a very, very long tradition, a long discourse that, once again, has different things to say about the proper role of leaders in secular society than maybe either the communists or the new capitalists are offering.
Yeah. So, and I think that, just to reiterate what we talked about the last couple of episodes, this is, again, like you said, a culmination of thought that's been happening for quite some time. This isn't something that was just invented. And I think it's really interesting that he's, up to this point, led us on this journey of why we understand this way, and then proposing, here's where the states come in. Here's the role of the state. Here's the role of we'll get to it in a minute. But what I do love in paragraph 32 is what he defines as a prosperous state. And I think when you look at maybe our political climate today, it's quite interesting that it goes right into how a state chiefly prospers and thrives through moral rule, well-regulated family life, respect for religion and justice, the moderation and fair imposing of public taxes, the progress of the arts and of trade, the abundant yield of the land through everything, in fact, which makes the citizens better and happier. How do you think that resonates today, Joe? How does that sound for us for our modern culture?
Indeed, yeah. It's definitely a different, again, a more integral vision of the state. Now, I know that term in a 2025 context of Christian political theory is going to be a little bit loaded. I don't mean integralism in maybe the sense that there are others out there that mean it. Nevertheless, it definitely is a proposal that I think is just completely out of keeping with the modern secular, status quo, where the state at best is simply protecting individuals' rights and settling disputes and conflicts when rights come up. This is really like John Stuart Mill's utilitarian kind of ethic of the state's role basically is to step in and prevent when your right and my right begin to conflict. They have to they're basically a conflict resolution agency. Immediately after kind of what you talk about there with, the chief things that prosper a state, he says that it lies in the power of every ruler to benefit every class in the state, and among the rest to promote to the utmost the interests of the poor. And he notes this in virtue of his office, without being open to suspicion of undue interference, since it is the province of the Commonwealth to serve the common good. And the more that is done for the benefit of the working classes by the general laws of the country, the less there will be need to seek special means to relieve them. And so he's saying a well-regulated state is first and foremost achieved through the writing of just laws and the maintenance of a just constitution and just laws. You won't have interference as much when you have a stable, let's say, constitution of the state. It maybe not a written constitution or a capital C constitution the way that we think of it. But that's one point that he's making there. But I think he's already responding to or preempting sort of the libertarian rejoinder when he says this is in the prerogative of the ruler without being open to suspicion of undue interference. In other words, he does not view government as a necessary evil. He does not view, all kinds of involvement of government in the ordering of society as something that is only invoked as a last resort. It's a positive role that government, in all authority, he will say, comes ultimately from God, and in the same way that God orders things towards ends and creates sort of boundaries. Excuse me. This is the role of the ruler in society. So it's really a remarkable vision at its time when it's articulated. Again, nothing new. It's what the church has been sort of saying perennially from the very beginning, and yet it needed to be restated in his time. And I think, if anything, it needs to be all the more firmly restated in our time, because I don't think that we have shaped society in the century and 20 years since Rerum Novarum. I don't think we've shaped society according to the vision of Leo XIII. Quite the opposite.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, going from paragraph 32 to paragraph 33. So of course we've established the fact that the state prospers and thrives through moral rule, well-regulated family life, respect for religion and justice. And then right on paragraph 33, he says there's another and deep consideration which must not be lost sight of as regards to the state: the interests of all, whether high or low, are equal. And I love that. And I think we're going to get to this distributive notion that we've been talking about and leading up to in these last couple of episodes, which I'll let you take over on that one. But it's really interesting that he goes specifically into this fact that just right off the bat in paragraph 33, the interests of all are equal. The members of the working classes are citizens by nature in the same right as the rich. They are real parts living the life which makes up through the family the body of the commonwealth. And I love this Christian language that he's using here. It's just really, we're all part of, one body. And as we're talking about the state, and talking about, the polity of these things, it really is all of these individual parts that are making up this commonwealth. And he actually alludes to that being done through the family. Right. And that's really what's kind of binding all of this together, is through the family. Maybe unpack that a little bit as well.
Yeah. So paragraphs 33 and 34 really are kind of a joint piece here, where he makes two different kinds of arguments sort of for the same thing. One, he says that because all citizens are sort of equal before the state in a fundamental way, it belongs to the species of justice that is called distributive justice. This is the obligation of a community towards the members of that community, that the state treats each and every class alike. And so he's really here ruling out a kind of favoritism. Yeah. However, in the very next paragraph, he then caveats that, or he fleshes that out in 34 to make a few clarifications that are useful. One is that we're not talking about egalitarianism. We're not talking about leveling society. That's not the way to achieve distributive justice. It's not, so you could see that as an arguable point, right? That someone would say, well, if the goal is to treat everyone alike in society, then why don't we just make everyone the same? And then we can kind of have, and that's the socialist's answer. Stamp everybody gets the same ration, blah, blah, blah. This is not his vision. He says there will be these different roles. There will be those in power. There will be those in exercise of authority, etc. So he says there's going to be, when we're speaking about the state treating people alike, we mean in terms of fundamental justice and in accord with the role that each plays within society. And then he also flips this to say, in the second part of paragraph 34, that because of the role that labor plays in the state, this large mass of people that without which the prosperity of society can't be pursued, that it's only fit and also because they're lacking in power, because he recognizes that those who gain in ownership will also gain in sometimes civic power alongside that. It's not unfitting for the state to have a particular interest in the welfare of those who are less privileged or downtrodden within society, such as the workers were at the time.
Sure.
So at first reading, you could read paragraphs 33 and 34 and think they're almost contradictory to one another. He says, on the one hand, you act towards every class alike, and then in the next paragraph, he basically explains how the state should act differently towards these various classes. But I think it is all of a piece. It just depends on defining your terms carefully. That when he says, treating all classes alike, he means with respect to their fundamental rights of justice, etc. He doesn't mean that the church, that the state, and the church for that matter, can't take particular care for some individuals in society. And again, we see that from Scripture on forward. The poor deserve always special consideration, and that's simply a matter of justice.
Right. And he does go into justice a little bit as well. He mentions here that it's so important that it may truly be said that it is only by the labor of working men that states grow rich. Right. And then he goes on to say that justice, therefore, demands that the interests of the working classes should be carefully watched over by the administration, so that they who contribute so largely to the advantages of the community may themselves share in the benefits which they create, that being of housing, clothing, bodily fit, that they may find their lives less hard and more endurable. And I think it's interesting that he's taking that idea of justice of, look, this working class is benefiting, the state, of course, because it's making the state rich, but it's the state's responsibility to make sure that the working class is also being carefully watched over, so that their contribution is also being taken advantage of by the people who are contributing, right? And that's kind of this idea of distributing, the idea of the class and being able to take what they're doing for the benefit of not only society but for the benefit of themselves. And I think that's a clear distinction and an important distinction that we need to make in 33 and 34. And I think that's where maybe capitalism gets wrapped in a little bit, is this idea of just producing more money for rich and rich and rich, right? Without thinking about the benefits to the people that are laboring. And I know, Joe, you and I have talked about this at great length, especially when it comes to some of the mechanisms that are being used for artificial intelligence and training the machine and things like that, of ensuring the rights and the justice of the workers and the people that are doing the work.
Exactly. And, just as in the economy of his age, so in our day, it is very often if you think of the way that outsourcing of labor happens and to the nations and communities that are maybe called upon, just think of, the most pedestrian example that many of our listeners will be familiar with is calling a customer service line and hearing who answers the phone. And, this isn't bigoted. This isn't racist. You can bet that there's a certain part of the subcontinent of Asia from which, a lot of these call centers will operate, because that's where American industry outsources those jobs to. But it is precisely that dichotomy that Leo is calling out, that, that very often these are customer service lines. You could call your major manufacturer who makes all manner of appliances for help with your air conditioner because your air conditioner isn't working. And you speak to somebody, in a room in Kolkata, which is probably just operating simple fans because they don't have air conditioning. And this is precisely this sort of like very concrete way of imagining what it is that Leo's getting at here. That if you participate in the generation of these goods for society, you have a right to participation in the enjoyment of those goods to a certain extent. And it is in the interests of the state and in the prerogative of society to see to it that equitable disposition is found. Now, again, we're not talking about redistributing wealth. We're not talking about taking away and reapportioning things, but we're talking about creating a system of laws, creating a system of regulations that would prevent the need for that in the first place, as he says up at the end of paragraph 32. Excuse me.
Yeah. And so as we move into paragraphs 35 through 39 here, we take this approach of, the state should allow some sort of beneficial oversight to the people that are doing the work. But it really is, and he's referenced the family a couple of times, but we get in paragraphs 35 through 39 where he really is modeling a paternalistic vision of the state.
Right.
which is very different, I think, from what we've seen in the past, and what we're seeing today is really modeling the idea of the state as the family, not necessarily, like you said earlier, a necessary evil, but its authority is of divine origin, right? And that's where we're getting at with these next couple of chapters here.
Yeah. It is this sort of in those paragraphs 35 through 39, he kind of point by point goes through, again, always with a mind to answer the would-be critics. So he says, we've said the state must not absorb the individual of the family, or the individual or the family. Nevertheless, he says that, at the bottom of that paragraph, as the power to rule comes from God, and is, as it were, a participation in God's sovereignty, then all sovereignty, or all power to rule, should be exercised as the power of God is exercised, with fatherly solicitude, which not only guides the whole, but also reaches to individuals. And again, this is a remarkably different vision than kind of a radical libertarian point of view. But he's not advocating for the creation of a nanny state. So he
Right.
is sort of trying to, toe a fine line here and lay it out. And he says, individuals that suffer when the general interest of a particular class suffers. This is going into paragraph 36.
Right.
Now the state does need to step in. But even in paragraph 36, he circles back around at the end saying there are limits to this. Those limits are defined by the nature of the occasion, calling for the law's interference, the principle being that the law must not undertake more nor proceed further than is required for the remedy of the evil or the removal of mischief. And this is sort of the he doesn't use the word. It will later enter into the papal lexicon with Pius the 11th, but this is subsidiarity that he's talking about, basically. And this is the other principle of subsidiarity. So it's not good for the state to go in and take the roles of lower orders unto itself. However, it is the duty of the state, when there's a failure at the lower levels, to step in and to provide for what is lacking.
Right.
And so he's laying out kind of both prongs of that principle in this section.
So what happens to the poor? I know we've talked about subsidiarity as well, and so I don't think he really loses sight of that either in these next couple of paragraphs, is where he's specifically talking to those people that are benefiting society benefiting from these individuals, making sure that society has this, more of a divine implementation of and a fatherly solicitude over it, reaching out to individuals as well. And he never releases the idea of the poor and the badly off. Right. And he's always calling them back to maybe having, what does he say here? To have a claim for special consideration for the poor.
Right.
And I think what that's meaning as well is that it's not just on society, but it's also on the individuals, right? To be looking after and have special consideration for the poor. So maybe talk about that a little bit. Is he talking just a society level, or is he talking an individual level there? Or how should we interpret that?
Well, he makes a very common sense point. He basically says that, look, the rich can look after themselves, and therefore it is precisely for that reason that we the poor deserve this special manner of consideration, because the poor do not have of themselves, the working classes don't necessarily have the resources. Now he's going to go on later in the encyclical to talk about some means that they can use, such as by cooperation and organization. Which is where he sort of lays out his vision for the ideal structure of labor unions or the like. And he's already getting there with this discussion, though. Part of the reason that the poor require special consideration because they're left without power, but they're also precisely the targets of this new ideological attack coming from socialism. They're also the one whose morals are going to suffer under the status quo, because they're being forced to work on Sundays, or they're being forced into mixed sex workplaces where modesty is not observed, and so forth. So he's very concerned about these folks, and saying that it's in the interests of the common good. It's in the interests of society to make sure that their looked after. It's not that he's forgetting about the rich or the welfare of the rich. I guess one thing that you could say that is worth noting is that he always has the spiritual good of man kind of top of mind. And I think that that's important. He does say in here somewhere, and I can't find the reference right now. It may be earlier in the encyclical. But he mentions something to the effect that what we're, if we go about all this social change and maybe we lift up the material conditions of the poor, but their religion is not safeguarded and their morality is not safeguarded, and they're not being formed well as virtuous citizens, then it's all for naught. And he quotes scripture. He says, what good is it for a man to gain the entire world but to lose his soul? And so I think that that's another important lens through which to read these proposals that he's making. He's always concerned with the moral welfare of people, and he sees that this new kind of poverty, the poverty under the extant system of capitalism, is vitiating workers. It's making them vicious. It's causing a degradation of morals in society. It's making them open to new moral failures by agitation and stirring them up to rebellion and revolt and violence against the owners.
Right.
And the brilliance of the suggestion that he's making is that the remedy for one is also the remedy for the other, because he's already acknowledged that the rich, as Jesus said, we don't need to remind the rich that their souls are imperiled, right? Right. To the one who has great responsibility, much is demanded, or the one who has gained more of him, more will be demanded. And so they should know, where they stand in that. And so he's kind of pointing out that, like, by treating your workers more justly, you're also helping yourself morally. You're saving yourself from peril too. So the one solution, as it were, which easier said than done, I grant, but this allocation of justice in society will help both classes in precisely the way that they need it most, by helping them live more virtuously.
Right, sure. And I think you're referencing there's a lot to unpack in paragraph 36. I would encourage anyone, by the way, if you're not reading along with us on the Vatican website, you can of course find Rerum Novarum and walk along each paragraph with us. But in paragraph 36, it's great. He says, now it is to the interest of the community as well as of the individual that peace and good order should be maintained, that all things should be carried on in accordance with God's laws and those of nature, that the discipline of family life should be observed, and that religion should be obeyed, that the high standard of morality should prevail, both in public and private life. So again, here he's going into what you were just saying, Joe, is that the end result, the ultimate claim to this, really is peace and good order. That's what should be maintained here. There's a line of justice and making sure that justice is being served correctly, but really it's on both sides of the equation that only proper order is maintained through the community and the individual by these few things, living in accordance with God's laws and those of nature and the discipline of the family. And he kind of goes through each one of them. So I think that's a really interesting perspective as well, as it's on all of us, to make sure that we're living in good order and that peace should be maintained. And like you said, he walks through a couple of proposed situations where he calls for, whether or not a law is interfering, whether or not those principal laws should be undertaken. But really interesting. So there's a lot to unpack in paragraph 36 as well. Like you said, is where he goes into subsidiarity. Now, for the wage earners, I know specifically we talked earlier on about wage earners, and what he's recommending here is that since they mostly belong in the mass of the needy, they should be specially cared for and protected by the government. So what we're meaning there is that there are, kind of to reiterate what you were saying, there are opportunities where the government could come in, and they have a special they have a special charge in caring for and protecting these wage earners. So maybe unpack that a little bit too, Joe. And maybe for those that haven't listened to the last couple of episodes, what are we referring to as wage earners? We're not talking about these 1% wealthy class.
Right.
Well, they're earning wages as well. We're talking about a different type of wage earner.
Yeah, I mean, so the status in society at this time is basically that there are those who can be secured against the future based on what they own, usually a stable ownership of land at the time. Now, later, as the century goes on, the 20th century, maybe what classifies as productive property or the kind of property that safeguards you for the future will get experimented with or toyed around with in different papal encyclicals. But here, that's what he has in mind. The rest of the people are those who depend upon a wage contract for any preservation against the future. This is sort of the point that he's making. They have no capital, even if they have a little savings that they could put by. It's rarely sufficient to have a hope of any kind of future procurement of means of production whereby they could establish a living for themselves. So this is sort of the way that he's looking at the division of the classes. And so he has particular interest and care for those that are underprivileged in the system by being so dependent. But again, also because they're where the threat is coming, and he's prescient. This is 1891, so we're talking about a full, decade and a half before the Bolsheviks, revolt. He already sees on the horizon that this will be stirred up into a violent kind of revolution. And ironically, he says that one of the things that will motivate this is greed. And it is greed that is precisely, in a certain sense, the sin of that capitalist class. So it will now be by the workmen seeing what the haves have, the have-nots see what the haves have, and they're jealous of it, and they become greedy for it, and now they go into this violent revolt. And this is what he kind of predicts will happen, but also it's not a hard prediction to make because this is precisely what the Marxists are calling for. This is what the Marxists say has to happen. This is actually the nature of society, that this is what defines the class dialectic, this kind of conflict and this kind of division of interests. So it's a remarkable section. As he goes through, in each of these following sections, really from 32 forward, where he begins to talk about the state, then he'll sort of delineate different situations, and some of them were very, very pertinent to the time. So he talks about striking and the disruption that striking can have.
Right.
He also talks about the needs, the religious needs. Again, this is something he returns to again and again that we maybe think is fairly anachronistic, but just anecdotally, it's within living memory here in the United States, in many places, at least in certain generations, where if not everything, at least most things were closed on Sunday.
Not just Chick-fil-A.
Indeed, not just Chick-fil-A. And some people will view it as this great, victory for liberty that it's not kind of imposed. Whether or not it needs to be imposed at the level of laws is one thing, but not even the market forces present this. So these things go hand in hand. To the extent that we become a post-Christian society, we don't honor that day anymore, and so we don't make the economic choices or vote with our wallet, so to speak, in such a way that would help secure that day for proper rest and observance.
Yeah, and I think. Right, and I think this is a really good, but what you're getting at is, I think, around paragraphs 40, 41 is what we're really starting to track. And this is where things really get interesting, because to your point, it is one thing to make the decision to not, shop on Sundays or to not go out on Sundays and to maybe, save your family from doing that type of work. But what he says in paragraph 40 is very interesting. The working man, too, has interests in which should be protected by the state. And first of all, there are the interests of his soul. Which again, we're getting to this point of this isn't just a means to an end. This is an opportunity for the state to really play a role in salvation, right? And I think it's interesting. You're talking through Sundays, and of course he talks in paragraph 41, I believe. From this follows the obligation of the cessation from work and labor on Sundays and certain holy days. So he's saying this is something that's not just for us as workers, as working class, but it's also for the employer. This is on the employer to make sure that the worker doesn't have the opportunity to work on these holy days, because really it's in the interest of the soul.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into sort of the next major section. So he talks about Sunday worship, and then he will go through some prescriptions of the in between times, what a proper workday looks like. He says that the working hours are too long, the conditions are dangerous, they're involving the wrong classes of people, i.e., women and children. He says that work should be proportionate to the kind of work that it is, right? So that it's one thing to ask somebody to file papers for 8 hours a day. It's a different thing entirely to send a child or a young person, even a young adult, into the mines for 8 hours a day, because it's more strenuous work. And he says all of this should be taken account of. But to your point about like the condition should be such that the working man is not even tempted. This is something very fascinating that he goes into beginning at paragraph 43, which is the wage contract. And once again, completely different vision, I think, from what gets articulated in terms of contract theory and a libertarian approach to economics. Our premise, seeming to be, if maybe not stated articulately by everyone, I think there's definitely a general trend, even among Catholics, to think that, well, nobody's forcing you. Nobody's forcing you to sign that contract, to sign up for this kind of job or whatever.
Right.
But Leo very, very strongly comes down on the side that, well, you can be, on the one hand, sort of practically forced by circumstances. And in those cases, it's important to recognize what justice demands. And so he says, wages, we are told, are regulated by free consent, and therefore the employer, when he pays what was agreed upon, has done his part, and seemingly is not called upon to do anything beyond that. The only way, it is said, in which injustice might occur is if the master refused to pay the whole of the wages, or if the workman would not complete the work undertaken. Right? And then in the next paragraph he says, to this kind of argument, a fair-minded man will not easily or entirely assent. It is not complete, for there are important considerations that it leaves out of account altogether. And essentially what he says here, which is once again a perennial ancient sort of approach to this, and it regards man's proper use of freedom. You cannot justly enter into a contract that is in violation of justice or injurious to your own soul. So, I mean, take it to maybe the logical extreme limit case of this, but so-called sex workers in the economy, is the only question there whether or not they have freely consented to do the work, or they've signed the contract to do the work? Absolutely not. So there are all kinds of other considerations that basically impinge upon whether or not we can even countenance a certain kind of work arrangement within a just society. And one of those is the question of what constitutes a decent wage and a fair wage. And he will go down to specify what that is. It's a wage that allows for, ultimately, a more wide distribution of productive property.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think, taking it from the extreme of the sex worker, even taking it to the, I had a lot of jobs when I was a teenager where, Sundays were on the table for filling roles. And, as a worker, you felt an obligation, to fill those things. And I think that's what Pope Leo is talking about a little bit as well, is that shouldn't just be a decision up to the wage earner. The system itself is broken for even the opportunity that a decision is needing to be made to work on Sunday, right? And so I think that's an important distinction to remember. I don't think we're recommending that well, maybe we are recommending that, but I think there's an opportunity there to understand that if you are an employer, this is also very important to understand and start to keep in mind, these things that can bring about a health and happiness for your employees. And I forget what paragraph it is. I think it's around 41 or 42, which basically is talking about, we're not meaning idleness, right? And I think we get into this constant, battle with, well, if we're not working, it's idleness, and we're not doing anything productive for society, and we're not doing anything that's helping benefit society. And he kind of takes that and he looks at it right in the eye and he says, no, that's not the case. It's not about idleness. It's about resting from those things that are considered work for the benefit of the soul, again, for the benefit of holy days, for the benefit of your family. And I think that's a really important note, especially for us and for society. It's difficult, I think, to think that a lot of, if Costco's weren't open on Sundays, Joe, we might have a problem on our hands, and there would be people rioting in the streets. But it's important to understand that this distinction, again, isn't because of idleness. It's because of the care and nurture of the soul. Yeah.
And there's a lot we could talk about with the complexity that I think Leo is not naive about. That
right.
This does take everyone's part, because it's recognized that all you need to do is enter into it. So this is where you could make an argument that laws or regulations would almost be necessary, because if one player in the economy decides independently, I'm going to open on Sundays, well, now he has an unjust edge over his competition, and because the market force of competition is going to kind of drive this choice, this is how everything gets dragged in. And so ideally, sure, there would just be a compact or an agreement, even if unspoken, there would be some sort of agreement that this would not be undertaken. But in the absence of that, we should ask what best serves the common good. Right. And I think this is sort of a second major section. We've gone through the role of the state. It will now turn towards the working man and what the working man can do in Leo's vision to start to bring about this change in society that is looked for. Yeah.
No, and maybe this is a good stopping point here for this particular episode, because I think a lot of people are probably asking, okay, well, what is the workman's, what are the wage earners' roles as well, and what can these people do to help influence society? And we're going to get to that. And I think we're also going to get to a really important section in paragraph 46. So again, if you haven't pulled up Rerum Novarum from the Vatican website or just doing a quick Google search, please do, and make sure that you're walking along with us, because we're going to be diving into a really important discussion, an important section next time when we talk about workmen's wages and what it means to live comfortably and how we define that. So that'll be good.
Yep, and this really is, as we turn towards that section of the encyclical, this is a part that has probably the most profound influence upon Chesterton and Belloc in the formation of their thoughts. And so very excited to continue that conversation next time.
Great. Fantastic. So make sure that you're, again, Joe said it at the beginning, but make sure that you're subscribing to the podcast as we walk through Rerum Novarum, paragraph by paragraph. Make sure you've got a copy in hand to take some notes with us as we walk through. Joe, thanks again for all the work that you've done on this and putting the notes together. This is fantastic and a great learning experience and very enlightening. And we hope that it's gonna serve people well. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.